As I noted, we have two winners, one in each category, both very impressive entries. Firstly, I'd like to congratulate Alfonso Benjamin. Alfonso is from the Mac Robertson Girls High School in Victoria, and she is the winner of their written entry that explores what neurodiversity is and the several ways in which society can help neurodivergent individuals feel like they belong in a world where they interpret differently. And secondly, I would like to congratulate Megan Rosso, who is from, is it Emmaus Catholic College in New South Wales? And she's the winner of a visual artwork entry, which is in 5 parts, and it expresses the struggles of growing up with dyslexia and how dyslexia is perceived. So I'd like to invite maybe Alfonso and then Megan to maybe say a few words, if they would like, about the reasons that they entered the competition and what the key messages are that they would like for people to take away from their artwork or their written and artwork entries. Sorry, I'm trying to get that right. Alfonso, would you like to say something about your written piece?
Yep. Hello, everyone. I'm Alfonso, and I'm from the Mac Robertson Girls High School. So I entered a piece in the competition about neurodiversity, and I did so because this is disability awareness that I was really interested in, and I thought it would be a good opportunity for me to research a bit more about the field and also maybe put forward some of my ideas to increase inclusivity. So I think it's time that we moved away from just awareness and real action, and we moved towards real action so that there can be tangible change made. So I hope that you enjoy my piece. Thank you.
So thank you for that, Alfonso. And I think it'd be great if you'd allow us to maybe show your piece or display the piece that you have written for people to read that are in this session. Are you happy for me to do so?
Yes, I am.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. I'll just quickly share a little bit here that shows that there's quite a lot of work that has gone into this piece, and it's really nicely written piece that Alfonso has sent in for us. But I'll make it available for people. I'll get Sally to make it available for people to read. All right. Megan.
Hello, I'm Meg. I hope you're all doing well. So my piece is on dyslexia specifically, and I have dyslexia and I've grown up with it my whole life, and it's more to show how people perceive dyslexia and how it's seen as this negative thing. And my whole life I've been called dumb and stupid, and it's really personally affected me to the point where I used to hate school, but now my teachers and family have shown me that it's a superpower in itself. It's a different way of thinking, and have shown me like how to move on from the little barriers it gives you, as well as seeing how it can help me in my school life.
Fantastic. Thanks for giving us that insight. I'm just trying to, are you happy for me to just give people a little bit of a preview of your artworks here? It's a 5-piece compilation, I think. You're meant to see all of the pieces, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Yes. Right. Are you okay for me to just briefly display them?
Yep. Go ahead.
Okay. Hopefully everyone can see this. So this is the first part of the artwork, and there's a nice description of the different components. So one's got a bit of colour and you've changed the backgrounds. And we can see all of the words that are in the background here. So very powerful pieces of visual work.
It's great, really good. Very powerful, yeah.
So I will make those available as well for people to enjoy in a bit more detail once I can get Sally to put them up for everyone. So I would really like to thank you both for sending in those wonderful pieces for us to enjoy and consider. Now, Sally, who's our wonderful administration person here at TARSA, will be sending off your prices early next week. She's a little bit inundated with work at the moment with the conference. The prize for each of the winners includes an iPad and a certificate, of course. You both get a complimentary student membership for TARSA. You also get a $120 gift voucher for Officeworks and a copy of the book that's called Growing Up Disabled in Australia. So congratulations, guys. Really well done. I welcome you to stay on the session and listen to the papers. Yeah, please give them a hand.
Yeah.
I welcome you both to stay on the session and listen to the papers if you like, but you are also free to leave if you need to. Thank you for joining us. I would like to welcome Dinesh Wadiwell. Am I saying that right, Dinesh? He's a senior lecturer in human rights and sociological studies at the University of Sydney. And he's author of a monograph, The War Against Animals, and the co-editor with Matthew Kruller of Foucault and Animals. Dinesh is currently a co-investigator with Dr. Linda Steele and Dr. Claire Spivakovsky, did I say that right, in a project on complaint mechanisms relating to violence for the Royal Commission into Violence, Abuse, Neglect and Exploitation of People with Disability. Welcome, Dinesh.
Thank you. So could I just acknowledge the land that I'm on? So I'm coming from the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation in inner Sydney. So I pay my respects and acknowledge sovereignty was never ceded on the land that I'm on. Could I extend a huge congratulations to Alfonso and Megan for your contributions and for winning the prizes. They look fantastic and I look forward to looking at them, both prizes really carefully when they're available. Thanks for the opportunity to talk today. I'm not going to do PowerPoint, I'm just going to talk, and I'm talking through some ideas I've just been milling around for 2 years. And I'm in this weird position that I'm a scholar around disability rights, but also do a lot of work around animals and animal rights. And I'm interested in this intersection, which is what I'm going to talk about today. We're at a point where there's some really exciting, I think, trajectories going on in these two spaces of scholarship. Between disability rights and animal rights. But it's been a pretty rocky road to this point. And part of this has been about the history of animal ethics in the last 4 decades. Lots of the debates in animal ethics and animal rights have been founded upon debates in philosophy that happen around animal ethics. And one of the most prominent scholars in that space is someone you may have heard of, Peter Singer. Peter Singer, his book, Animal Liberation, and some of his writings produced some highly problematic views around people with disability. I'm not going to rehearse these views here because it's a bit unnecessary. And to be honest, his views are just offensive. But they have continued to frame the tensions that are going on between animal rights and disability rights to today. That said, I think there's some really interesting trajectories that have emerged in the last 5 years that I think are just fascinating. One turning point is Sonora Taylor's 2018 book, Beasts of Burden, which I highly recommend if you haven't read it. It's remarkable because Taylor doesn't just say there's a tension going on. She actually says, well, actually there's a lot of overlap between the experiences of people with disability and what we put animals through. And she thinks that through in a productive way as a woman with disability herself. There's some other really interesting things going on in this space. In critical disability studies, there's been a continuing interrogation of the human. Who is the human? How do we understand the contours of the human? And this happens to merge with lots of work that's happening in new materialist feminism, post-humanism, animal studies, critical race theory, which have all been doing this work of interrogating the human and the violence that has been done by the creation of these normative, often colonial visions of who the human is. So in that respect, I think we're at an interesting time where maybe we can actually approach some of these questions around the relationship between disability and animality in more sophisticated ways. Today, I want to take a slightly different route. Rather than look at the resonances between animality and disability, as some scholars have done, I want to instead look at the relationship between different subject positions and violence, and in this case, torture. I want to understand how the use of particular violent practices interacts and shapes bodies in different ways along the lines of human and animal. I want to compare the effects, not to argue that there's anything similar necessarily about the experiences of violence, but instead to point to how different economies produce different subjectivities. My starting point for this analysis is a short section of Darius Rajali's monumental 2007 text, Torture and Democracy. And I'm sorry, there's a plane going overhead and sirens in the background, just to complete the picture. This book, Torture and Democracy, remains one of the most important books on torture published in the last 40 years. Rajali systematically explores the range of different torture techniques used in the 20th century and seeks to understand their rationality. It's pretty grim reading, to be honest. In this book, Rajali advances what I think is a disturbing thesis. He argues that democracies have not necessarily shied away from torture, but instead they have been the innovators in creating torture practices in the 20th century. Part of what has driven that is the need to defy human rights norms. So democracies have innovated in torture techniques that defy detection. Rajali describes this as clean torture. It's in this context that Rajali spends a lot of time talking about electricity as a tool of torture and its important history as a clean torture technique. The advantage of electric shock is that it causes intense pain, however, it is not lethal. And importantly, it leaves no marks. As I shall discuss, these factors are all very important and have different significance within different contexts. In this discussion of the emergence of electrotorture, Rajali acknowledges that the emergence of electroshock began as an animal story, and I quote, "Men electrified dogs, cows, horses, pigs, and even an elephant. It is also a story about the public's growing appetite for meat. The Picana electra, basically a cattle prod, comes directly out of Argentina's burgeoning beef industry. The ECT machine would not have existed except for the fortuitous and fortunate circumstance of pigs and pseudo-electrical butchery developed in Rome," end quote. Despite these shared connections, electrotorture's first objects were animals. The motivations and the way in which this violence is deployed by the stockhand or the police interrogator or the mental health practitioner differ in terms of their effect, and that's what I want to talk about today. The motivation for the deployment of the cattle prod against animals is both its efficacy in incentivizing animals to comply with the wills of humans, but also importantly, the fact that it leaves no marks. The cattle prod uses pain to incentivize movement, to encourage animals to move from one enclosure to another, to force animals to enter and board an animal transport, and potentially to convince animals to continue marching down the corral towards the stun gun that will end their life. The device thus works against the resistance of the animal to ensure compliance with human domination. Its function is to use pain to counter insubordination. The fact that the cattle prod leaves no marks gives this instrument a benefit over other instruments of torture, such as a whip. However, the motivation for clean torture in animal agriculture differs from the motivation for this same torture in a police cell. Where electrotorture in the context of policing of humans is utilised, it is utilised because it defies detection. The victim cannot prove that they have been tortured when they've been electroshocked. Bodies leave no trace of ill treatment, and this produces a different economy. Within animal agriculture, the cattle prod is favoured because it preserves value in the final product of the production process, i.e. meat. Use of other techniques of violence potentially risk damage to the final product and thus pose a challenge to animal agriculture producers in maximising profits. Here, the integrity of the body of the animal is maintained by the use of electric shock, not due to any interest in the rights or welfare of animals, but simply because it is more profitable to do so. There's another important difference between the use of electroshock and other contexts when we look at the way that electroshock is used in the context of policing. In general, torture is carried out for a number of reasons, including to terrorise individuals and their families, or as forms of punishment, or as ways to enforce discipline and compliance. Within policing context, the often cited imperative to torture is the demand for information, which is considered by the torture regime as essential and urgent. Here in the context of policing, the use of electroshock is highly effective, particularly in the ability to apply tens of thousands of volts to the skin of torture victims, elicit confessions in a very short period of time without killing the victim, and simultaneously leave no trace. Here, the quest for information drives the torture process. While the drive for information is important in other policing contexts, the torture of animals is almost certainly not informed by any quest for information in the form of a confession. Instead, we're more interested in this context, animals are not used to produce confessions to elicit urgent important information. The pain is there to incentivize movement. Similarly, we can note that the use of electrotorture in disability-specific contexts is also not driven by any quest for information. Instead, it aims at disciplining behaviour and punishing non-conformity. One of the most infamous high-profile uses of electroshock against young people with disability was used in, again, the infamous Judge Rottenberg Educational Centre in the United States, a private residential institution for children with disability. In a recent article on NBC, a victim survivor, Rico Torres, who's now 24, describes being forced to wear a graduated electronic decelerator at the age of 8, and I quote, "They draped a 12-volt battery over his shoulders in a backpack, while a nearby teacher held a clear plastic box with a photo of his attached. When Torres misbehaved, the teacher would reach inside the box and push a button that sent a 2-second jolt of electricity coursing through his body. Torres could be shocked for threatening to hit another student, or for running away, for swearing or screaming, or refusing to follow directions, or for inappropriate urination. One employee," he said, used shock while he was asleep. The electrodes stayed on his skin 24 hours a day for most of the decade until he was 18 years of age," end quote. Here, the object of torture is to incentivize behaviour change, or response to what is called in different jurisdictions challenging behaviours or behaviours of concern. But we could also read these forms of torture as being a sort of punishment insofar as violence is used as a painful sanction for behaviour that is regarded as an insubordination or as a risk to others. I note that insofar as the person being shocked may not realistically be able to change their responses, this isn't so much a punishment for bad behaviour, but a punishment for who you are. The Judge Rottenberg Centre's use of shock is different from the continuing use of ECT as a treatment in mental health contexts today. At least under Australian law, ECT treatment is meant to be only applied where a person consents and carried out while individuals are unconscious. The person is anaesthetised and given muscle relaxants. However, there has been much recent press about forced use of ECT for involuntary mental health patients. Close to 700 treatment orders are endorsed a year for forced ECT treatment. The use of non-consensual ECT treatment is a surreal form of violence. As indicated, the victim survivor is drugged and wakes up after the procedure. ECT itself fogs the memory. This means the victim survivor is aware that they have experienced violence, but do not recall the exact details of this. A victim survivor describes her own ordeal of being strapped and forced into treatment repeatedly, and I quote, "I've lost count over the years. I would say close to 100. It was always against my will. I felt like I was being wheeled down to the gas chamber, really. You wake up with a headache, feeling really empty, like it's all been restarted, with memory loss and poor concentration," end quote. To conclude, the point for me in understanding these different uses of similar electro-torture practices is the way in which each forms its own subject. Here, violence sculpts the individual in relation to power. The prisoner interrogated by the police is subject to the regime's demand for information as quickly as possible, combined with the need for secrecy and to leave no marks. This differs from electroshock used against animals. Animals are shocked in food systems as a means of ensuring compliance, but the demand for clean torture is shaped by the brutal realities of the profit motive and the need to preserve the saleability of meat. Finally, for people with disability, this torture is best aimed at disciplining with violence, but perhaps more accurately, a punishment for being who you are. This violence is clean in more than one way, including the way in which it is sequestered within institutions, hidden from public eye, and on occasion, drugged out of the memories of its victims. This also tells us something about how people with disability are positioned in relation to the human norm. It's quite unique with respect to its own horror. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dinesh. What a thought-provoking presentation with some really interesting parallels. There are certainly parallels that I hadn't really considered myself before. I'd like to, I'm sure there's lots of questions on this, but I'd like to keep people, can you please write your questions down? We're going to have a question session at the end, just to make sure that we can kind of facilitate the proper discussion. So is that okay, Louisa? Yeah. Okay. So yeah, please write your questions down, or even post them in the chat so that we make sure that we get to them after the last presentations. Thanks again, Dinesh. So our next speaker is Stephanie Mantilla. She is going to speak about the invisible disability representation as alternate approach to inclusive health messaging. Stephanie is a PhD student at Sydney University. Please begin your presentation. Have you got slides?
Yes, I've got some slides. I'll just share them now. Okay, hopefully they're visible. Thank you. So today I'll be talking about some of the ways that we can potentially improve representation and inclusion for people with disability when it comes to health promotion campaigns. And I'll be doing this by presenting the results of a creative method where I asked people with invisible disability to make their own Instagram post for an imaginary health campaign that was inclusive of their experience of invisible disability, and reading that through the theoretical framework of biocommunicability. So research shows that people with disability tend to be excluded from the target audience of a lot of health promotion campaigns, which may in part be due to the difficulty of addressing the diversity of different disability identities. Nonetheless, many people with disability tend to be high risk for the health concerns that are being addressed within these health campaigns. So it's really concerning that they're often not represented, or when they are represented, they tend to be represented in tokenistic or medicalized ways, with the latter being especially true for people with invisible disability, who make up as much as 90% of all people with disability. So the way that I define invisible disability within my study is as any impairment, illness, and or condition that isn't immediately visible in most everyday circumstances. So for example, lupus or fibromyalgia. They're just two key things I want to highlight with this definition, namely that it includes illness and therefore overlaps in the territory of ill health and includes a wide variety of invisible disability identities. And secondly, that it also recognizes that invisibility is a subjective notion that is dependent on temporal, spatial context, and also the viewer themselves. So when it came to the creative method, it was loosely inspired by photo voice, and it involved my recruiting 12 female participants aged 18 to 35 to take part in a two-stage approach. In the first stage, they were asked to create their own Instagram post for an imaginary health campaign that was inclusive of their experience of invisible disability. And in the second stage, they were asked to partake in a Zoom interview where they were asked questions about their disability, their health information collection habits, the reason that they created the Instagram post that they did, and also about their views on two Australian Instagram health campaigns, namely the Girls Make Your Move campaign and the Healthy Eating Active Living campaign, both of which are obesity prevention campaigns. And then I analysed the results through a thematic analysis. So the theoretical framework that I'll be drawing upon today is biocommunicability, and that was proposed by Briggs and Hallen. And basically it just argues that all forms of health communications have something to tell us, not just about health and disease, but also about the nature of the communication itself. So the roles of different health and communication actors within that communicative process. Briggs and Hallen contend that there are three dominant models that we find within the media. However, I'm just going to present the two that are relevant to the talk today. The first of which is the biomedical authority model. And this model is relevant because the Healthy Eating Active Living campaign and Girls Make Your Move campaign and pretty much most health promotion campaigns tend to adopt this model. It's where the campaign manager essentially has an invisible role when creating the media. Their role is kind of just to highlight the biomedical perspective and kind of present it as objective fact when it comes to health. Here, the medical practitioner's role is just implied to be educating the audience on how to maintain their health, and the audience are assumed to be passive receptors who just unquestioningly accept that as the truth. So the other relevant model is the active patient consumer model. And here the campaign manager's role is actually to convey an array of different perspectives on health, which is including the biomedical perspective on health, but not limited to that. Here the audience are imagined to be active consumers who are shopping around for the best health information and advice for themselves and just applying that to themselves. They're thought to be a little bit more active in this one. And the reason that this is of interest is because a lot of the participants in my study identified with this particular view of themselves as an audience member. And I'll be using these models as a kind of heuristic to think through the ways that we can potentially improve the way the healthy subjects are presented in campaigns, the way audiences are imagined, and potential exclusions when it comes to people with this invisible disability. So when it came to results, if you're interested in seeing the participants' posts, you can scan the QR code on screen or look up exploring_disability. However, what was surprising was that a lot of the participants were a lot less interested in visual representation, with only 2 of them actually attempting to visually represent their invisible disability in the posts that they were making, despite that Instagram is a very visual platform that has that platform vernacular of aesthetic visual communication. However, they did want some level of representation and inclusion, and that was often in the way that they had more inclusive, and they often wanted that through more inclusive ideas of health. So, and that's pretty evident in some of the themes that I'll be discussing. Namely that participants actually expected to be excluded from the health campaigns and often envision themselves as active patient consumers. And many of them described their attempt to be healthy as a struggle because of their invisible disability, and as a result had adopted more flexible ideas of what constituted exercise, the correct amount of exercise and diet, and also had more kind and compassionate approaches to health. So I found that all the participants had actually expected the health campaigns to exclude their experiences of invisible disabilities. So for example, Sarah, who has schizophrenia, told me that it just feels like those campaigns are targeting somebody who's not you. And I think this just goes to show how people with invisible disability generally aren't part of the imagined audience. However, what was surprising is because most people expected to be excluded, many of them were actually willing to adapt that broad information within the health campaigns to make it relevant to themselves. And as a result, a number of them really liked the health campaigns that they were looking at on Instagram. So for example, Felicity, who has anxiety, depression, and migraines, told me that over time, I've learned to take those recommendations on board and apply them to my own context and work within the framework that I work within. So when I talked to the participants about their habits around finding health information, they all painted themselves as active patient consumers who'd seek out information from an array of different sources, whether it be online sources such as the campaigns that they were looking at, or medical professionals, and would then adapt and apply the information as was relevant to their own situations. And I think from the outset, this highlights that there's potentially a little bit of a disconnect between the more passive audiences that the biomedical authority model kind of assumes that audiences are, and also the more active audience that people with invisible disability are potentially envisioning themselves as. For all the participants, their invisible disability also had some effect on the maintenance of their healthy diet and or their ability to exercise in some way, and this often had to do with their invisible disabilities causing experiences of pain and or fatigue. So for example, Bree, who has depression, was telling me how sometimes she'd feel so fatigued that she'd rely on something called a depression meal, which is basically just a meal made up of anything that you have the energy to put together, irrespective of whether it's traditionally considered healthy or not. And a lot of the participants explained that it was a struggle to maintain this kind of more medicalized view of an appropriate exercise routine and healthy diet as portrayed in the campaigns. So Bree also noted that, yeah, I make a conscious effort to try and go to the gym 2 to 3 times a week. For a lot of people who are quote unquote normal or able-bodied or able-minded, I suppose that's just what they do when kind of outlining that struggle to maintain her health. So as a result, of that struggle, what I found is that a lot of participants had adopted more flexible understandings of what made up a healthy diet or correct exercise routines that challenged the biomedical authority model and what it was suggesting that was correct for the average person in the campaigns. And whilst there was some different views on whether biomedical information was kind of helpful to begin with, I think the clearer issue was that the campaign managers were kind of beginning with an imagined audience of healthy, able-bodied people. And the flexibility that participants often had in their health behaviors also tied into the final theme, which was the importance of compassion and kindness to oneself when enacting these health behaviors. So a number of participants found that their views on being healthy were less strict and medicalized and more compassionate after inquiring their invisible disability. So for instance, Rhiannon, who acquired permanent sciatic pain in one of her legs, was explaining to me how she no longer saw herself as fundamentally healthy after acquiring her invisible disability because she was no longer able to exercise. However, that it had also helped her redefine what healthy meant to a point where I can do stuff if I want. I'm a lot more compassionate towards my body now because I know it's trying its best. And the importance of compassion and kindness in health was also a common theme that was illustrated across participants' Instagram posts. So I'll just put up a couple of examples on screen. But in essence, a number of participants found that these more medicalized views of the correct diet and exercise that were portrayed in the campaigns were often too rigid and absolute, and therefore excluded their experiences with invisible disabilities. So participants wanted this view of health challenged in one of two ways usually. Firstly, by including the representation of the struggle that people with different invisible disabilities face when trying to maintain this view of health. And this perhaps reflects how people with invisible disability usually aren't shown as the healthy subjects, or at least people who are trying to also maintain their health within these health campaigns. And secondly, through the inclusion of more compassionate approaches to health that were more flexible in nature and adopted more flexible understandings of what made up the correct amount of exercise or a healthy diet. So overall, whilst these results definitely aren't generalizable, I think what the study shows us is that even though there's a lot of diversity in invisible disability identities, health campaigns can still potentially make really broad changes to make them more inclusive, such as addressing that disconnect between the way campaign managers are potentially imagining audiences and the way people with invisible disability may be imagining themselves as audiences. I think it's also potentially quite reassuring that people with invisible disabilities seem to be willing to overlook visual representation, even on very heavily visual platforms like Instagram, when it comes to representation and inclusion, and also would be willing to adapt broad health information if need be. However, at the same time, I think it's really important that we strike that right balance between some level of representation and inclusion for them, such as including their experiences and ideas of health. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. That was a really nice piece of work there. And I think that, again, that brings up some different angles on daily life or experiences of people in ways that not everyone may consider. Some things that might be taken for granted in terms of health messaging and how that gets out. So well done. Thank you for that. Again, I'll ask you to either hold your questions till the end or ask them in the chat. Next is Karen Soldatic. Where are you, Karen?
And then I have to pin myself. Okay, all right. I am going to quickly run through my presentation to make sure we've got some questions for time. And part of that is this is really part of a forthcoming book chapter on the Pedagogics of Human Rights, done by my colleagues from Curtin University in the Centre for Human Rights. And as many of you know, I've been working in this space and exploring these issues for a long time. So, this is actually written in collaboration with one of my colleagues, Michelle Fitz. And really how we come to this idea is actually, often in disability studies, we're always thinking about what disability teaches other disciplines. And I guess we really came to this topic thinking about all of our conversations actually as researchers within the disability space and how we needed to really undertake a range of adjustments, changes, to really think through about who we are as settler colonial scholars and what our locations actually were, which for Michelle and I are quite different, and how, like, for me, in my own context, in terms of the former Yugoslavia, or what's now known as Croatia, being part of that minority, but here, how that relationship of power actually shifts. And then thinking about what that actually means for us as disability researchers and how we engage with questions of disability. So, and part of that is about when do you prioritise notions or foreground notions of indigeneity, and when do you foreground notions of disability, and who has the power to determine that within the research process itself. Okay, so
Karen, I don't know if it's just me, but can you try and stay closer to the microphone, because I'm sort of losing some of your words.
Okay, all right. So, really what we were thinking about is thinking about decolonising our pedagogic practices researchers, and how that is also actually related to our practices as disability researchers. So when we were invited to write this chapter, what we were actually put to us is the challenge of what have been the unique moments of learning and critical pedagogic practice as researchers who engage in the settler colonial space particularly in rural and remote communities, and how are we situated within that as disability scholars? What are the pedagogics of our decolonised practice? And what is the relationship to disability? And as some of you probably know, I've done quite a lot of work within the Global South to think about this relationship in terms of the production of impairment and how that becomes absent in global debates around disability rights under colonial and imperialist structures of power. And then how to think about that relationship between having an affirmative politics of disability rights and while simultaneously recognising the reproduction of impairment, and how we engage with that under practices of austerity. And what stories are we able to tell as settler colonial disability researchers? Is that better in terms of volume? So we were asked to actually go back to the work of Paulo Freire, which for those who don't know, Paulo Freire was kind of really the leader in this idea of critical pedagogy. So thinking about education, or as he describes it, as an education from below. So how have minority groups been historically positioned, and how does that actually frame educational praxis? And, you know, it's thinking about the settler colonial context of Australia. I mean, if we think about the role of eugenics in settler colonial governance, you know, eugenics actually operates, whilst we often talk about within the disability sphere as quite general, eugenics actually has different modes of operandi at different historical moments. And education is particularly important in terms of this whole notion of absorption into the white population, which was highly racialised, which was seen as or conceptualised within eugenics as a positive eugenic practice. And we believe that, you know, we now refute that against negative eugenics praxis within settler colonialism in and of itself. So thinking about that relationship and its system of governance. The other thing that we were actually also asked to do is think about, you know, the politics of austerity, and what does that actually mean for Indigenous disability identity within the settler colonial context of Australia. And for me in particular, that really drew me back to Sila Ben Habib's work, who is a Sephardic Jewish woman from Turkey, now residing in the United States. So, you know, a woman, much as myself, that has fairly minority status in different contexts within homeland and here, and how does that get played out in terms of being a researcher around issues of human rights, and thinking about her notion of what she calls troubled times. And, you know, she's really kind of writing at the heart of the US situation with the emergence of the transferal into the Bush regime of power, and what that actually means for global politics and types of abuse that emerges in geopolitics. But for us, really, in the settler colonial context in terms of disability, One of the things that I've always been really interested in is, there's been lots of focus around formal structures of support, particularly at a time that we see with the NDIS, where that becomes a centralised policy. But actually what we know is that really caters for a very small minority of people with disabilities. And what we've actually seen with the implementation, the way that that's realised, not just in terms of postcode, but the redistribution of funding, it's really highly racialised, classed and gendered in its distribution of resources. And so whilst there's on the one hand, there's been a level of, I guess I would say, celebration in terms of its and that's really been the dominant narrative about making it a better system. There's really been legal interrogation of the way its relationship to other notions of disability that operate and are being, I guess, stripped back in disability areas across Australia. So that's why coming back to her work about thinking about human rights in troubled times and marrying that with Paula Ferreira was particularly important for us for this piece. I do have to say, it kind of feels a bit, I don't know, kind of the opportunity to actually reflect on our own practice as researchers within this space, looking at this intersectionality, whilst at one stage, is this notion of reflective practice. It also feels quite privileged that we've actually been able to, or been granted the time to think that through. I guess one of the things is it really kind of drove a number of questions for us. And that's really coming back to the idea of how do we understand hope, resistance and solidarity in this space that is highly contested, privileges some notions of the disabled body, and negates or denies or leaves absence others. How do we think about the role, this struggle really coming back to Nancy Fraser's work around this intersectionality or the tensions between the politics of redistribution, recognition and representation at the same time in the settler colonial context. And what roles did we play as researchers, and how did we, in this role as researchers within the disability space, when did moments of privileging disability actually override experience of racialisation and long-standing inequalities that emerge in that role, and when did the privileging of indigeneity actually take away practices of Indigenous peoples who at times would embed themselves as a disabled subject for first and foremost, as a way of as a practice of reparatory justice under structures of social redistribution. So these are the kinds of things that we really draw out in our discussion here about what thinking through researching at this intersectionality, and also to what were our responsibilities of representation. What should we write about? How do we what might seem important matters for us? How do we engage at this peripheral, what often is considered at the periphery of disability studies? How do we engage in a way that brings to the fore not only their voices around issues that need to be changed, but also simultaneously draw back on areas where Indigenous people with disabilities under settler colonialism, whilst they might tell you as a researcher that simultaneously do not actually want or shouldn't really be within the public arena, because it might lead to negative consequences. So these are the kinds of questions that we explore by being a disability researcher in this space. I guess just, one thing, these are some of the things that we need to, that we consider in this piece about really, every moment is really thinking about, what are the relationships, or what are the lines between solidarity, respect and witnessing, and how do we articulate that in our work and our processes of engagement. What does actually decolonization actually mean? Particularly when we're looking at these, very complicated relationships between decolonization, disability and reparatory justice, and the possibility of disability being framed in an alternative way that can at times sit in contestation to the majoritarian disability view of what disability is in public discourse. And then how do we not only foreground the voices and narratives and the demands for justice within the Indigenous disability space, but how do we position those so that, we ourselves don't take over the space, but we enable our research participants to, so we step back. So how do we step back and understand our role as being really facilitators or enablers of the voices to be heard rather than actually speaking? So these are the things I've just discussed. Sorry, I'm being disorganisation. So how do we understand settler colonial logics? And I guess one of the things that we, what's the relationship of this continuity that I discussed earlier on about, we're thinking about much more critically the differentiation of eugenics practices across time, space, and its meaning from now. So thinking of the ways in which refusing disability in the settler colonial context, such as Australia, actually has its own practices of racialisation, and how that gets played out in Indigenous relationships of disability, in Indigenous care relations, and the ways in which disability, whilst can actually be used as a technique to deny Indigenous structures of familial or kinship care relations. So thinking critically about when disability should be foregrounded and when it should be put in a different structural or relational mode because of the history of Indigenous dispossession and the way that those eugenic practices have a level of continuity that becomes embedded in everyday state policy. So this is, a typical situation that we found, which is a quote where, despite the level of disability, what we find in Indigenous Australia is that people with disabilities, Indigenous Australians with disabilities, despite the multiplicity and chronicity of disability that they experience, are frequently denied, and that this is actually intergenerational. And what are the implications of denying or refusing disability under settler colonial regimes, but also the complexities of being a mother of an autistic child, where you've got your own disability and care needs. And so, one of the really difficult things is because of this historical process of racialisation and child removal, it's not just for Indigenous mothers in particular, it's not just a matter of declaring one's own impairment to access the resources and supports that you need as a disabled carer, but thinking about, you know, what are the implications of being a disabled parent in the Indigenous context, and how that might signal the possibility that you as a disabled Indigenous woman are unable to provide care to your disabled child. So thinking about all of those things are things that we had to carefully think about as disability scholars working in this space, and really working through what they wanted us to tell us to understand the broader picture and what Indigenous disabled people were actually happy for us to report and write about in our research. So I guess my final thoughts are, you know, what's the intersection of Indigenous disability rights-based pedagogies? And is it in disability Indigenous, or is it Indigenous disability? And, you know, when do we juxtapose those and swap them around? And that even though it appears as though the relational structure between disability and the state has changed, once we think about disability intertwined with settler colonial structures of long-standing rule, of racialisation and racism, you know, what does experiencing the state's refusal of disability demonstrate about the coloniality of disability biopolitical systems for internal population management? And how do we work with Indigenous Australia as disability scholars in engaging in a disability praxis that doesn't further embed those historical structures and reproduce them in our own work? So that's it for me. I'm going to stop sharing now. Thank you. And put myself on mute.
Thanks, Karen. No, another really interesting paper, and I think there's some really important issues there to consider for us as researchers in these spaces on being careful and but also the reflexive side of things. I think is something that is super important to, you know, how do we affect as researchers where we're going into communities and whatever our responsibilities there as well. Okay, so questions for Karen in the chat or after the last paper, which I will try to get through fairly quickly. Now, I don't have slides, but I will share very shortly just a screen view of a document. But for starters, I just want to explain that this paper is about exploring challenges and barriers to inclusive culture and medical education, especially for students and potential students with disability wanting to become doctors. So I have to warn you, this paper is still a work in progress. I'm trying to work through some of the challenges that are coming with pushing long-standing barriers and beliefs in the health and medical professions. And I certainly welcome any comments and suggestions on the concepts and ideas that I'm raising in the paper so far when we get to that. So diversifying the health workforce to represent and respect the varied peoples that it serves is increasingly a global concern. In higher education more broadly, this concern is met through widening participation movements, which have spread across education systems in the United Kingdom, United States, and also here in Australia. But despite the prevalence of disability in the general population is around 20% or so, the number of students, medical students with disability in Australia remains quite low, and it's less than 2% as far as we can estimate. And this is low compared to other post-secondary courses, which sit around 5%, they're still low. And United Kingdom medical schools sit around 4%. Now, since the Australian research about doctors and medical students with disability is just emerging, we don't really understand the reasons for representation, and so that's speculative at the moment. But the figures that we have in terms of what I've just presented, those we get from University Disability Services, and therefore they only count those people who go to services to disclose, seek support. So we can, of course, have to consider non-disclosure. Official figures are, of course, likely not to reflect actual numbers of individuals with disability who study medicine or who are being accepted into medical school. Now, recent changes in medical education policy in Australia towards a more inclusive approach in medicine is an important step forward or toward increasing disability diversity in medicine. An inclusive medical education system that welcomes training and graduating doctors with disability will expand representation of our diverse community and may offer contribution, particularly to valuable patient care. The policy changes that I am referring to is this document, Inclusive Medical Education, Guidance on Medical Program and Applicants, Program Applicants and Students with a Disability, which was launched by the Medical Deans Australia and New Zealand in April this year. I was a member of the working group that developed the Medical Dean's new guidance document, and the group task was originally to review and update the 2017 guide on inherent requirements to studying medicine. The review and redevelopment process took just over 18 months and involved much debate in the group around the changes, consultation with a very broad range of key stakeholders and also legal advice. However, with some convincing evidence, the group eventually turned away from that exclusionary concepts that are associated with inherent requirements and unanimously agreed that a strengths-based approach was more appropriate for progression in medical education and practice. Some of the changes included considerations for what constitutes reasonable adjustments of medical skills and what skills are actually required by a doctor. So I'll keep that one up. The guidance document has been well received by the Australian Medical Council, and the move towards inclusion in medical education is backed by community support. However, there's still work to do on the ground, I feel, before inclusive approaches become embedded in medical education and practice. Several challenges to inclusion are systemic or entrenched in medical education standards, norms, and processes, which are all connected around this disclosure requirements and the power relationship between medicine and disability. So in this paper, I explore some of these challenges, or at least think about them out loud, by focusing on the idea of disclosure and using ableism as a lens. And for this purpose, I refer to Fiona Kumari Campbell's work. Campbell suggested ableism is more than a matter of ignorance or negative attitudes towards disabled people. She says ableism is deeply seated at the level of epistemological systems of life, personhood, power, and livability, and that ableist corporeal configuration is immutable, permanent, and laden with qualities of perfectionism. So these are structures, values, and assumptions deeply embedded in medicine. My aim here is to highlight how these deeply rooted ideas may challenge inclusion of medical students and doctors with disability. So I'll talk about disability disclosure first. Anecdotally, there's a reluctance amongst medical students to disclose disability or illness. Miller attributes the main reason for choosing non-disclosure to factors such as fear of discrimination and presumed incompetence, and concerns about lack of understanding amongst patients, colleagues, and the general community of what constitutes disability. In a 2019 study, Neera Jain explains that for some medical students in the US, understandings of stigma were associated with potential risks to their careers and not being seen as capable professionals. Students were intensely aware of the negative consequences that might accompany being public about their disability, from the possibility of losing faculty or peer support for future jobs to missing out on competitive postgraduate training opportunities. Often they would consider carefully political disclosure in terms of access needs, or whether making do with imperfect accommodation would be sufficient in order to appear less difficult. Stigma and discrimination. The fear of stigma and discrimination on disclosure is not surprising. People with disability are subject to ableist attitudes in many sectors, often especially in the healthcare system. As Campbell says, medical professionals have been accused of contributing to discrimination experienced by disabled people. The most serious assertion is that doctors represent one of the disabling professions, which contributes to the social exclusion and dependence of disabled people. The medical profession continues to play a powerful role in the lives of people with disability. Doctors are regarded by medical associations and governments alike as authorised experts, having the power of disability certification, acting as gatekeepers to specialist services and supportive funding. Also, medicine is, at the base, a discipline that thinks pathologically. According to a velocity of knowledge that has exponentially increased since the 18th century via scientific experimentation and technological advance, Nielsen suggests that medicine functions according to the basic idea that healthy is normal, unfit and unhealthy is abnormal. This aligns not normal with unhealthy and not able. In terms of inclusion in medical education, this is then at odds with the elitist notions around what constitutes a good doctor, and with some of the core values in the highly competitive medical education environment, such as perfectionism and competence. As disclosure is a personal choice, students may find themselves in that difficult situation of risking reputation as less able by disclosing disability versus establishing themselves as an asset to the profession. Competence and risk. Good doctors are expected to demonstrate a level of competence in safe practice. In medical education standards, disability is located at the interface between individuals and an evaluation of desired level of performance. Shrewsbury and colleagues noted that concepts of impairment is typically invoked in these standards as part of health status and disability, but also when referring to concerning behaviours such as drug and alcohol abuse associated with unsafe and unprofessional practice. Therefore, by association, impairment suggests unsafe or unprofessional practice by individual with disability, which further problematizes disability as a threat to competence and thus to being a good doctor. Impairment is associated with problematic practice and not commensurate with competence, and therefore not to the professional image of a skilled practitioner. So, building towards inclusion and disability justice in medical education. A culture change is clearly needed in medicine that counter ableism ideas in order to build diversity and inclusive practices. Language of policy and standards reflect embedded norms and hidden assumptions, which in turn may lead to unintended consequence of perpetuating barriers to learners with disability. This can be and currently are being addressed by identifying different frameworks. For example, competence and risk can be reconceptualized as the products of interactions between environments and systems, which may fit poorly with individuals rather than as inherent qualities of the individual. Despite the likelihood of medical professionals seeing people with disability in their daily practice, very few medical schools provide curricula that offer a socio-political lens on disability issues or opportunities for students to properly understand health and social inequities for people with disability. A process of transformative education leading to systemic change is needed. This should include curriculum development, better education of medical students about disability issues to consider educational options rooted in justice, along with structural mechanisms to challenge stigma and discrimination. Thank you.
Okay, great. So we've had some questions in the chat box. One of the things that you've responded to, Dinesh, already is Raylene's question. And I was wondering if you'd like to talk a little bit more about that Dinesh, before we moved on to the next question?
Can be so super quick. So Raylene's asked about legally authorised forms of torture and how extensive are they? And I can say that they are extremely extensive. So various forms of violence are authorised by law against people with disability. Many of these forms of violence have been quite clearly found to be acts of torture or ill treatment by credible human rights bodies like the Special Rapporteur on Torture. I put in the chat that 2 weeks ago, the NDIS Commission announced that there were 1 million unauthorised restrictive practices against people with disability in the last year. That doesn't include authorised restrictive practices where no count is kept. It doesn't include all the restrictive practices that are used in other settings such as education or health. It doesn't include other forms of torture such as forced treatment that routinely happens and forced sterilisation, those sorts of things. So I would say my summary is there's an epidemic of torture, legally authorised torture against people with disability here and elsewhere in the world.
I'm just going to respond. I think they would count the authorised ones because they have to be reported onto like in disability, they certainly have to be reported onto a critical incident reporting system. So internally, they would know the official ones. But having said that, like, it was a very good presentation. We've done some work on, workforce training around use and misuse of restrictive practices. And it's just such a challenging area, just trying to get workforce understanding of what constitutes a restrictive practice, in terms of financial restrictions, lifestyle restrictions, social restrictions, as well as those more hardline ones, which are more obvious, like seclusion and physical restraint and sedation. So, there's a lot of workforce training to be done, in terms of the disability perspective, and in trying to improve that space and, reducing what you exactly said, it constitutes a torture, even if it is in a behavioural support plan, and it's a regulated thing to control a challenging behaviour, the extent to which that's right, and the extent to which the restrictive practice is used first rather than as a last resort needs to be very much questioned. And often the untrained support workers will jump towards the restrictive practice just as a first option because they can't control the situation. So so good research needs to be examined, this area. It's very important for people with disability who haven't got much voice and and like people with mental health in restrained settings are very much vulnerable to these practices, and it needs to be sort of brought out and exposed to lots of things.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Raylene. There is a question to Owen, but I'm actually going to go to Louisa Smith because she's actually had her hand up for quite some time. Over to you, Louisa.
Thanks. I have a few questions, but I'll keep it brief. The first one, Dinesh, thanks so much for your paper. I was just really interested in how you were looking at how differently the violence was operationalized, the economies, I guess, of the violence. And I was particularly interested in terms of queer histories and how electroshock therapy has been used in conversion therapy. And just in terms of, I was thinking it through around how it adds another layer in terms of, the eradication of self. You talked about that sense for people with disabilities that, that it is punishing someone for being something that they cannot be. And I guess in some ways, from a queer perspective, there's something similar that's happening there. And I think to me that is a really useful comparison. So I was just wondering if you'd thought about that. I assume you have.
Just quickly say yes. So ECT has been used in a variety of settings, and its function is to punish nonconformity.
Yeah.
But as I mentioned, it's potentially punishing a person for who they are, which also has its own history in terms of histories of violence and torture. And I suppose what's disturbing as well is that ECT causes quite violent, like involuntary movement. And the reason individuals are sedated and anaesthesized is so that you avoid breaking your teeth, breaking your bones through the violent movements. So this is, if we think this through, it's highly disturbing that you would force this treatment on someone. Consenting to the treatment is one thing, but being forced to undergo the treatment would be another.
Yeah. Okay, I'm actually going to transfer to Dinesh. I'm going to take you off and just spread you across so we're on gallery level. We actually have one other question from Owen. It's again for Dinesh. Owen,
Karen, I wondered, I might answer Josephine's question in the chat, and then other people can talk.
Great.
Is that so good?
Yeah, absolutely.
I'll do that now.
Do. Other questions? Louisa, one
I'm
more.
sorry, I leave no one else has one. It was for Stephanie. I really found that paper really interesting, and your methodologies, obviously there's a lot that you can't talk about in such a short period of time, but just really fascinating how you've developed that methodology as well. But my question, I don't know if you went to Christy Newman's plenary paper earlier, but I think that you talked a lot about the kind of work that the participants were doing around their health, that they were adapting and appropriating and then rejecting certain aspects. And I found that really interesting. And I feel like that when I first read Christie's paper, which is about inclusivity labour that she wrote some time ago, I really thought it should be applied to disability. She was applying it to gender and sexuality. And I think it would be really, really interesting to apply that theory to disability. And I think that what you're talking about is a really incredible form of inclusivity labour, where people are having to do a lot of work themselves to be able to access health services in a way that is useful for them, and also kind of public health promotion in a way that is meaningful for them, and they have to do a whole lot to do that. So yeah, that was just a thought. I was curious about why you chose to use the obesity campaigns, to ask people about obesity campaigns, and I was wondering if you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, thanks. I'll definitely check out Newman's work on inclusivity labour. I hadn't heard of that before up until just now, so thank you for the recommendation. So I originally so my whole PhD is kind of looking at those two particular obesity prevention campaigns, and they also influenced the participants I ended up choosing because they were aimed at females aged 18, or the overlap, I guess, was females aged 18 to 35. But I think it was just kind of it was honestly just an area of health that I was originally interested in. And I guess, that's not a fantastic response, but that was, I guess the area of health I was originally interested in when I started my PhD. So that's kind of the reason I've, continued on with using obesity.
So it's just how it evolved, rather than it being about
like a case study as opposed to, there being a particular reason. I guess it's also kind of interesting that obesity is kind of a very visual thing, as opposed is like very visually can be quite clearly visually represented, whereas invisible disability isn't. So I was kind of interested in the overlaps of visibility and invisibility as well, and questioning that throughout my PhD. But it kind of ended up just being more of a case study kind of thing.
Interesting. That's really interesting.
That's great, thank you. So we already are 24 minutes over time, so we thought we might just take it to 2:30. Does someone have another question?
I've just got a quick one. Lisa, thanks for your presentation. We've just put in a proposal on co-participation for the medical students at Melbourne Uni, and getting them to have a better understanding of what it means for co-participation in the disability studies or the disability field. So when they're doing research, given the things that you were talking about, the objectification of people with a disability and it being very much, fix, treatment, cure, you know, which is their thing, which is what the medical profession does, but that there's sort of like the other side to it in terms of, you know, people maybe wanting to use sign language instead of a cochlear hearing implant, and the tensions in the medical profession, and then the tensions in the disability field around that objectification of disability. So maybe we should touch base, and if we get the proposal, I need to definitely talk to you about disability in the medical profession. So thanks.
Yeah, thanks for that, Raylene. It is a big question. It took a long time to kind of get people in our working group to change towards that more, you know, enabling model, you know, a positive approach to inclusion rather than this, you know, are you aware this is what you need to do because you should consider whether you're suitable for this. So that was kind of the wording in the original document. So it took quite a long time. And I'm finding, you know, in terms of actually implementing these guidelines in the real world, it is still a lot of work to do in practice, you know, that it doesn't happen overnight just because you have the guidelines.
Yeah, that's good. Great work.
Okay, are there any more questions, or shall we aim to close the session? That's great.
I think we might just say that there's another disability session on Friday morning on disability studies at 9 o'clock that Karen's chairing.
Yeah.
And then we have our thematic group meeting at
Shortly after.
It's in the afternoon on Friday as well. So there's 2 more sessions if you want to come along.
Yeah, and also too, Lise, it'd be good to mention that Ryan Thornycroft has taken over the group from this point forward. And he'd be keen, he's really keen to hear from you all. So we'll be setting up meetings for next year and to see how to take the group forward. But I think also, Lise, we really want to thank everyone who really contributed to, there was a lot of work done this year from CDS members, especially around writing guidelines, setting up the competitions. You know, really fantastic participation. We had a number of, outside of this, as you're all aware, we also had Social Science Week. We also had the Accessibility and the Arts panels earlier this year. And we really want to thank you all for really, as Sally Daly at Tarsus says, really, we were the most active group in TARSA in the thematic group this year. Actually for a long period of time across all groups, and we really couldn't have done this without everyone really supporting us along the way and writing things like the guidelines, the criteria, doing the marketing,
all the new resources that are on our page. There's so many new great resources that members have written and put up, both written and presented. So there's some videos, so if you haven't looked at them, go check them out and direct people that way that sort of need some basic information about critical disability studies. It's really good work.
And great resources for teaching as well. So yeah, and we now also have some international members. So yeah, so I guess watch this space, and Ryan is really excited to take it forward. Ryan's also really keen to find another CDS member, particularly an ECR, postgrad ECR, that would really like to work with another ECR and take it forward. So please come along to the TG session on Friday. But thanks so much for joining us, and thanks to our panellists, and congratulations to our Fonzie and Mel.